The Public Server Manifesto. The Public Server Manifesto. Part 1. Why this exists. There comes a point in a man's life when he realizes he is no longer merely living inside a world. He is also living inside a script handed to him by parents, teachers, institutions, media, religion, peer pressure, national myths, cultural habits, and the 1,000 invisible little incentives that reward obedience over honesty. By then, the damage is usually already underway. He has learned what to say, when to stay quiet, which truths to soften, which instincts to suppress, which questions to avoid, which contradictions to tolerate, and which lies are considered polite enough to repeat in public. He has learned how to survive socially. He has not necessarily learned how to live truthfully. The public server was born out of that tension. It did not begin as a polished brand strategy. It did not emerge from a marketing boardroom or from some sterile attempt to reverse engineer a niche. It came from a more uncomfortable place. It came from frustration, from cognitive dissonance, from personal failure, from political disgust, from moral impatience, from the slow, humiliating recognition that I, like most people, have often been better at identifying bullshit than at fully refusing to participate in it. That matters, because the public server is not the product of a man who believes he has transcended weakness. It is the product of a man who has become increasingly unwilling to romanticize weakness, excuse cowardice, or make peace with confusion simply because confusion has become fashionable. It is the product of someone trying, in real time and often imperfectly, to close the gap between what he claims to believe and how he actually lives. That gap is where most lives quietly rot. People say they value truth, but lie to keep the peace. They say they value health, while poisoning themselves in slow motion. They say they believe in freedom, while demanding that others shut up. They say they care about justice, while protecting whichever cruelty their tribe has normalized. They say they want authenticity, while performing acceptable versions of themselves for an audience they secretly resent. They say they hate propaganda, but only when it comes from the other side. They say they believe in courage, but what they usually mean is courage in other people, preferably at a safe distance, preferably on their behalf, preferably without any social cost to themselves. I know this terrain well because I have lived in it. I know what it is to overthink instead of act, to intellectualize instead of decide, to know better and still not do better, to be more articulate than disciplined, to care deeply about moral questions while still struggling with ordinary human appetites, avoidances, addictions, and inconsistencies, to be theoretically stoic and practically agitated, to be capable of tenderness and still sharp enough to wound, to obsess over minor details while neglecting major structural failures in my own life, to hate hypocrisy, including my own, but not always quickly enough to prevent it. That is part of what this project is. The public server is not a stage on which I pretend to have solved myself. It is the place where I refuse to hide from the process of trying. The name matters. A server is a place where information is hosted, exchanged, made accessible. It is public because the point is not merely to think privately, but to speak, to expose, to clarify, to test, to risk, to stop treating one's worldview as a guilty secret or a loose collection of private intuitions never disciplined into language. Too many people live as silent tenants inside ideas they have never properly examined. They feel the tension, they feel the contradiction, they feel the lie, but they never drag it into the open. They never articulate it. They never force themselves to ask, what do I actually believe? Why do I believe it? Is it true? Is it coherent? Does it survive scrutiny? Does my behavior reflect it? If not, why not? That, to me, is one of the deepest forms of public service still available: honest articulation. Not activism in the shallow modern sense, not branding for its own sake, not slogan manufacturing, not emotional theater dressed up as conviction. Honest articulation, the discipline of naming things clearly. The willingness to say what you think, not because your thoughts are automatically precious, but because unexamined conformity is one of the great engines of both personal and civilizational decay. That is why the public server exists. It exists because comfort has become a false god. Comfort now governs far too much of modern life. Not just physical comfort, though that too. Intellectual comfort, social comfort, moral comfort, narrative comfort. People want beliefs that flatter them, politics that excuse them, philosophies that soften reality, and communities that never demand any real confrontation with self or world. They want a morality that feels nice rather than one that bites. They want a politics that signals compassion without requiring courage. They want freedom for themselves and censorship for their enemies. They want authenticity, but only within approved parameters. They want self-improvement, but without shame, discipline, sacrifice, judgment, hierarchy, standards, consequences, or any serious reckoning with failure. In other words, they want transformation without fire. They will not get it. One of the central assumptions behind the public server is that truth matters more than comfort in the long run, even if comfort often wins in the short term. The truth may embarrass you, but delusion will deform you. The truth may isolate you, but cowardice will hollow you out. The truth may demand that you change, but avoidance will chain you to versions of yourself you already know are beneath you. This is true at the personal level. It is also true at the level of culture, because this project is not only about self-development in the narrow, private, lifestyle sense. It is also about the ideas that govern society's institutions, moral codes, political movements, and civilizational survival. I do not believe personal development and public philosophy can be cleanly separated. The self lives somewhere. The self is shaped by language, education, propaganda, religion, law, national memory, cultural norms, media narratives, and the moral assumptions of the age. A weak person is easier to manipulate. A confused person is easier to govern. A cowardly person is easier to silence. A population trained to confuse tolerance with surrender, compassion with moral chaos, and freedom with the refusal to defend itself will not remain free for long. That is why the public server must be about more than habits and motivation. Yes, it is about discipline. Yes, it is about health. Yes, it is about addiction, self-sabotage, procrastination, body management, personal responsibility, and the ugly daily trench warfare required to drag oneself out of passivity. But it is also about worldview, morality, speech, civilization, sentience, religion, politics, history, propaganda, the stories that make men either stand upright or collapse inward. I reject the demand that one must choose between personal growth and serious ideas. That is one of the great modern frauds. The same culture that tells you to journal, hydrate, optimize your morning routine, and protect your peace will often recoil the moment you start applying moral seriousness to anything politically charged, culturally protected, or socially dangerous. It will happily let you improve your productivity while discouraging you from improving your clarity. It will encourage you to find your voice only so long as your voice says nothing that disturbs the liturgy of the age. The public server rejects that arrangement. It rejects the idea that self-help should be ideologically neutered. It rejects the idea that personal development should be reduced to aesthetic routines and emotional maintenance. It rejects the idea that all moral claims are subjective. It rejects the idea that civilization should be ashamed of defending itself. It rejects the idea that bad ideas deserve immunity simply because they are old, popular, culturally protected, or wrapped in victim language. It rejects the idea that comfort is a sufficient organizing principle for a human life. And perhaps most importantly, it rejects the idea that one must be perfect before speaking. That last point matters because perfectionism is one of cowardice's favorite disguises. Many people do not stay silent because they have nothing to say. They stay silent because they know exactly what they want to say but are terrified of saying it imperfectly. They are waiting to be cleaner, leaner, calmer, more credentialed, more healed, more accomplished, more rhetorically invincible, less contradictory, less vulnerable, less open to attack. They are waiting to become the kind of person who could speak without risk. That person does not exist. The public server begins from the opposite premise. Speak from inside the struggle. Think in public. Refine in public. Admit contradiction in public. Crawl forward in public. Not because public confession is automatically noble, and not because privacy has no value, but because silence has become far too rewarded, and because many people will only find their own courage when they watch someone else refuse to wait for perfection. That is what I am trying to do here. Not to preach from above, to wrestle in view, not to posture as pure, to speak as someone attempting to become less false, not to offer the audience a tranquilized version of growth, but a more serious proposition that a good life requires clarity, that clarity requires confrontation, and that confrontation must eventually include both the self and the world. That is the opening principle of this manifesto. The public server exists because private thought is not enough, because a worldview kept hidden calcifies into fear, because moral seriousness must eventually touch behavior, because discipline without philosophy becomes empty grind, and philosophy without discipline becomes decorative cowardice, because people are starving for permission to think more honestly than their environment allows, because speech still matters, because civilization still matters, because truth still matters, and because I am tired of living as though it does not. All things considered, the public server is where I try to close the distance between what is true, what I believe, what I say, and how I live. PSA: if your private convictions and public life are strangers to each other, that tension is not a minor discomfort. It is the beginning of a fractured self.